When you think about armed fighting in historical times, what are you imagining? Everybody has their own vision of what that might have looked like, influenced by a number of things. What you've read, educational videos you've watched, unfortunately even fictional movies you've watched, or video games you've played. Even though everybody knows it's just fiction, I've heard plenty of times people talk about history, and it's clear that they're really referencing a particular movie or video game or whatever. It's influencing their ideas on some level. Right? But even when you're going deep into the subject matter and you're looking at historical manuscripts and other sources to try to reconstruct combat, how much do we know? On the one hand, quite a lot, but on the other hand, there's so many gaps as well. And it can be pretty difficult to really approach the reality of it. Not just because of the limitations of the sources, but also because it's a multifaceted thing. Reality is complex, as much as some people wish it wasn't, apparently. So, what we do know, on the one hand, you have HEMA practitioners who are looking at manuscripts on fighting with various weapons. Long swords, sword and buckler, pole arms, daggers, etc., etc. And on the other hand, you have people who engage in fighting with reproduction weapons and armor independent of the manuscripts, or only loosely based on them. And they have very different opinions. So you have the academic approach, if you will. And when it comes to manuscripts, even then there's quite a bit of variety. You have the different schools. You have, for example, German versus Italian tradition, which are quite different. The basics obviously are very similar. Things like footwork and how to strike and everything. There's a whole lot of similarity, but there's also significant differences in particular techniques and overall strategies and tactics, all of that, right? And then within that, there's also variation. When you compare individual sources, there is a significant amount of time in between them, so things changed, obviously, throughout time, and between regions, and in some cases, we just don't have much. How did Scandinavians fight with long swords in the 14th and 15th century? No idea. I'm not aware of any sources. Or English longsword. I don't know of anything. I think there's like one or two without images, things like that, but nothing compared to the wealth of sources you have for German longsword, for example. So not every source is the same, differentiated by time period and region, and not every time period and region has extensive sources. In some cases we have nothing. If you think about Viking era fighting, we have no manuals as such. We have some information in the sagas and whatnot, but overall not very much. When it comes to how the Celts fought, for example, we know essentially nothing. Again, there are some sources, but those are Roman, and you should know about Roman propaganda being heavily distorted and skewed. And then there's a certain bias in even the most detailed manuscripts we have, because they were written by certain people for a certain audience. So generally you have sources written by either monks or knights or fencing masters, basically martial arts instructors of their day, written for nobility, not by or for commoners. There are always exceptions, of course, but by and large, history is filtered by wealth and prestige. It's not just written by the victor, it's also written by the upper classes, for a number of reasons. So I imagine that there might have very well been a different martial art or different systems, different traditions that were practiced by commoners that look different from the knightly arts. I have a strong suspicion that they did indeed have some kind of tradition and didn't just flail about wildly This idea that some people have that it was all just a matter of just hit them as hard as you can. It's all just about physical fitness, and there's no technique, none of this fancy hoity-toity stuff. It's all just bronze. And, in some cases, maybe. I have no doubt that sometimes this sort of thing happened, particularly on the battlefield. If you're dealing with conscripts, random peasants being forced to fight, and they may or may not have practiced self-defense to some extent in whatever spare time they had. But being on the battlefield is always a different story. It's a much more chaotic scenario. It's much more constrained by the terrain and by troop movement and so on and so forth. You might be starved and exhausted and sick when you have to fight. There's so many different factors. It's quite a different situation from like a judicial duel where you're on level ground in a circle with standardized equipment following some rules, etc., which in turn is again different from a private duel, the kind of illegal duel that people had where they would just meet up somewhere in the woods or what have you to satisfy their ideas of honor. Either way, we know of certain traditions that the low-born population engaged in, be it stick fighting or wrestling, things like that. There's probably a lot that we don't know because it wasn't written down, or if it was, the sources didn't survive. So you have that kind of uncertainty. And then even in the detailed manuscripts we have, there's also the uncertainty of interpretation. What you have to do because, well, it's not exactly an instructional video. The illustrations are sometimes, let's face it, terrible. You have to read them or look at them through the medieval artistic lens. They had certain conventions that may throw us off. They didn't portray things as naturalistically as we might expect. It wasn't a sequence of pictures to show the entire movement. It's generally just one, if you're lucky, two pictures, like before and after, but quite often it's only one. And the language is archaic to us and generally has to be translated. So then it also depends on the translation, of course. But even then, it's difficult to figure out exactly what they meant. Now, later sources are usually easier to understand. They're still quite verbose. But typically, the quality of 16th and 17th century imagery is dramatically higher, so much easier to see what's going on. But either way, you have to interpret it, and then there are generally a number of valid interpretations. There's an almost infinite number of flawed interpretations that just don't work. When you first try to understand what did they mean, then you try to get your body to understand it, shall we say. Then you practice it, and when you're confident in your ability to pull it off and you do it against a resisting opponent, then you might find, oh, it doesn't work. It falls apart. But even when you go through the lengthy process of studying the sources, trying to understand them, interpreting them, testing your interpretation, working on it over and over again until you reach something that you can pull off reliably against an unwilling opponent, so you have something that works, that still doesn't guarantee that it's exactly what they meant. Right? You can have certain variations in the interpretation that works, but it wasn't exactly actually what they did. Right? So there's so many layers, so many levels, so much depth that can throw things off. And then, on top of all that, not all sources and not all masters are created equal. Even back then, they disagreed. They very much argued and disagreed. And, no, your system is crap, mine is better, etc. And there were straight-up charlatans who just ripped people off, essentially scammed them out of their money by teaching them nonsense. Just like nowadays. The medieval and Renaissance bullshito, essentially, the equivalent thereof. And sometimes you have suspicious things in there. Like, techniques that are described, we just sit there like, there's no way you pull that off. against a fully resisting opponent. I don't see that happening in a million years. But then there's also good practical stuff in the same source. The hypothesis that some people have is that they deliberately snuck in nonsense in the event that someone rips off their work. You know, someone steals their work and teaches their understanding of what that master does, and then they can be exposed for, you thought this was real, you dunce. You just exposed yourself as a scammer, whatever, things like that. All right. Could that be? Yeah, maybe. Who knows? Then you have to consider that what you see in the manuscripts is generally meant for judicial dueling and self-defense, things like that, not battlefield use. Was that different? I would think that knights who trained these systems, yeah, they probably did use that. I can't really imagine that they had two completely different martial arts systems, one for dueling and one for battlefield. Some modification for sure, because some things don't apply the same way. But I find it hard to believe that it was two completely different schools. Maybe it was. I could be wrong on that. But I would think that knights probably did use at least a lot of techniques from the manuscripts, like footwork. Yes, it's going to be somewhat different. In fact, we know that military footwork is different. We do have some later sources for regimental, like Highland broadsword, for example. And yes, it does look quite different. The footwork is linear, back and forth, of course, because you can't really move much side to side. So yes, it is different. I basically just disproved my point that they probably didn't have two different systems, but there was a substantial overlap. That's really a better way of putting it. Yeah, because how you grip the sword, how you swing, how you generate force, how you throw feints, how you parry, there's a lot that carries over, no doubt about it. And finally, all that taken into account, there's also the factor of individual differences in skill. You know, whenever you see a video like Kenjutsu versus HEMA or whatever, you see people in the comments who are like, oh yeah, this shows that this is better than that, blah, 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 whatever. It's like, no. Are these the ultimate specimens of their art? Like, what does that even mean? Like, what is a fighter who is like the ultimate expression of that style? What is that? What's the ultimate Thai fighter? Muay Thai fighter. What is the ultimate boxer? Can you have someone who represents the entire system of boxing in one person, who has mastered it to the highest possible peak? It cannot get any better than that. And even then, what does that mean? There are different styles within boxing. The range of skill is enormous. I've talked before about the skill gap in HEMA. You know, from a total beginner who just started to the most skilled person, however you want to quantify that, the instructor with the most medals won, which again is not the same as, you know, the most skilled knight or whatever in history, because tournaments are a different thing once again. But either way, and just the same back in history, there would have been an enormous variety of skill. You can be sure that there were some people who fought just desperately swinging because they really didn't know how to do it properly. And then there were highly skilled, experienced knights and mercenaries, men-at-arms, etc., etc. So, yeah, battlefields would have looked quite different depending on... But at the same time, bell curve, right? The largest number of people would probably be somewhere in the middle, or maybe the largest number would be at the bottom end. That's also possible. Either way, so if you had the chance to watch two actual people in history fight, it would look so different depending on who it is and what their background is and all that. Anyway, that's a lot of babbling. As you can tell, there's plenty of layers. That's a lot of depth. And I would like people to be more aware of that, of the complexities of all this. So let me know. Maybe I did a halfway decent job, maybe not. There's plenty more always to talk about, but let me know what you think, and thanks for watching.